Gacha Rares. We all have them, we all use them, and we all have mixed feelings about them. These are going to be some of your main spammable CC, mid-range, or melee units throughout the entire game in differing ways. Because of this, they're also ancient and barely even get updates. I mean, look at how long it took for CATLANTIS and Shingon to get talents. But how about we really take a look at how useful each and every one of them are at all main levels? Can a specialist like Welterweight be a solid generalist with maxed out stats? Or can Pirate Cat be an effective anti-waver? Though I don't have a single cat that's near 50 plus 80, I still think that it'd be fun to analyze what these cats could do theoretically and how some of them, not all, would fare in generalist situations or against specific traits sometimes. Before we start though, thanks everyone for 2.6k subs. I started writing this when I had 2.3k and this was supposed to be my 2k sub special, but hey, here's a video now. A video where I'll be taking a deeper look at the effectiveness of all the original 25 Gacha Rare cats. As usual, before the video starts, here's a verse from the Bible. Matthew 13:44. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again and sold everything he owed to get enough money to buy the field. Pogo. Pogo's a weird meat shield, as with the cost of 360C, or for chapter 1, 240C, he's not really comparable to other units that cost just slightly more than him, as you'd have cats like Viking and Swordsman, and meat shield wise, you'd already have Tank and Cat. His only notable quality is his 50% chance to survive, but for where you are in the game, this isn't really something that'd come up in any important way. Level 20. Masai is similarly pointless. He gets a small stat boost, but is still nowhere near worth costing 360C. Using him by this point wouldn't make any sense. Level 30. And here's Jingashi's base form. His most notable changes are his cost reduction, i.e. 360C to 240C, and now his 100% chance to survive. He's still not that great of a unit, and he's barely worth the cost, as a now probably 20 plus 4 Wildcat is good enough in comparison to the negligible ability that Jingashi can give you for his higher cost. Frankly, he's not worth it. Jingashi maxed. He becomes alright, and this time his knockbacks actually come into play because of his HP, as he has 22.5k HP or 7.5k HP per his 3k beast. Because of his 100% survive chance, he technically gets 4 knockbacks, with the last one being at a 100% chance no matter if he'd normally be one shot or not. He also gains 3.6k DPS, so he can do some serious chip damage to LD based enemies if he's allowed to be stacked. He goes from 10 movement speed to 20, and he gains a 50% resistance to waves and a 70% slow resistance. Versus General. Since Jingashi's just a meat shield, overall I'd assume that he'd be pretty okay. With at least 2 knockbacks and 20 speed, he'd definitely be better for enemies with longer force swings or LD abilities, since he has high survivability and speed. On top of this, being a meat shield with a high DPS value for his costs makes him even more valuable for these special situations. His cost being 240C is still something I don't think he can really overcome though, and most of the time, using dual erasers is probably just as effective or more cost effective than using an eraser in Jingashi at the same time, for example. Is he solid? Jingashi is the unit that I have the least experience with out of all the rares, so I don't really have great knowledge of how this unit even is in regular circumstances, as I was never a fan of him. He does seem like for specific scenarios, he'd be useful when fully maxed out, for if you need a fast meat shield that's more useful in situations where higher knockback count for your meat shields or tankers is useful. So basically, I think he's alright, not really super solid, but I can't really say that he's bad or anything like a few of the cats that I'll be talking about later. Wheel. Once you get Wheel, there's no real reason to use him over someone like Bird, and once you get Bird, there's already no reason to use him. Whether or not you think Wheel becomes a total powerhouse depends on who you are, but for now he's a bit pointless due to him being a clone of Bird. Level 20. Solar Cat's just a variant of UFO with way lower DPS, though against aliens he has massive damage. Despite this, his low HP and 170 range makes him difficult to use. Level 30. With a range boost from 170 to 200 and a DPS boost from Solar's level 30 2.4k natural DPS to Chill's 3.1k DPS, he becomes a bit better at what he was made to do, being an alien melter. Of course, as an anti-alien variant of Bird, what he is on a face is extremely tragic. Aliens are known for generally having high range, so there aren't very many aliens he can even outrange despite his great DPS against them, at this point being 12.6k. And, as a Bird variant, his HP is pretty bad, as he only has 13.6k or a measly 6.8k per his 2k beast. What also hurts him from just doing quick burst damage for every time you spawn him in is his long force swing, so it's unlikely that he'd actually be dealing any serious damage if aliens can hit him. Chill maxed. At maximum abilities, you may expect him to still be pretty bad, and well, you'd be wrong. Now he's just awkward. Stat-wise, he'd have 45k HP or 22k HP per his 2k Bs and 10.4k DPS, or versus aliens, 41.8k DPS. As for his other abilities, he goes from costing 1050C to 750C, gaining a 40% chance of knockback and a resist weaken ability at 70%. Overall, his abilities are a little awkward, and he would have been better off with something like dodge or something defensive over KB and resist weaken, though they're not necessarily bad. Versus aliens, 41.8k DPS for a 750C unit, even if he has 200 range, just isn't a joke. If you can freeze the aliens or slow ones that can't hit him, then he's absolutely gonna melt them. Just to put that into perspective, that's about 3k more DPS than Awakened Bahamut at level 50 without talents. His HP is still kinda bad, as 45k with 200 range is a bit of a joke, so even at this level he'd still be situational, as you'd have to orient your loadout around him being able to survive against your alien threats. Either way, him having 41.8k DPS would automatically make him your strongest anti-alien given his spam ability, so orienting a loadout around using him versus aliens at this point would just be worth it. And it's even better if you don't have to do that, like if you're fighting someone like Naomi Boar or a lot of Scissoros, assuming that one range difference means anything. Annoyingly though, his chance to knock them back would most of the time just stop him from getting his absurd DPS value off. So if you somehow got chilled to this level, then it'd be best to just not get his KB talent. Versus General, 10.4k DPS naturally is really strong, and he clears all flying variants when it comes to DPS, though he loses out on 20 range in comparison to Manic Flying. Really though, he just boiled down to another version of Manic Flying with a bit more HP and less KBs, so whether or not he's useful depends on what you're fighting, just like his variants. And like other flying variants, that high DPS value doesn't mean much when their ranges and HP values are so low. Is he solid? I'd say so, since if you can get him focused on a group of aliens, they're just gonna die given his stackability and area attack. Though his range issue is what really holds him back, as at the end of the day, you can't go that far outside of his niche since he's a glass cannon melee unit, simply because of how the game works. Salon. Honestly, a legendary, albeit slightly outdated generalist unit once you get a little later into the game. Salon starts off as a solid unit that just costs a little bit too much, and by the end she's, well, I'd say it depends on the person. Level 20. Salon turns into Paris, and for most people, this is mainly when she'll be used. She costs 900C, which throughout the game is always pretty expensive, but her very low cooldown, 350 area attacking range, and at level 20, 714 DPS is solid for chipping enemies, especially since there basically aren't any other units by this point that could do something similar to her, aside from maybe a few first form Ubers or Ice Skating Cat. Level 30. All Paris gains is a small attack buff and immunity to weaken. It doesn't change her much from the solid generalist that she was already, and while immunity to weaken definitely doesn't hurt, it also doesn't help all that much outside of very niche scenarios. Cyborg maxed. At her complete max, she gains 32.7k HP or 10.9k HP per 3k Bs and 4.2k DPS. She'd also have a 50% survive chance, toxic immunity, and a 70% resist against freeze. Really, she just becomes a better generalist. Nothing too striking here. The only really questionable one is toxic immunity for a unit that already doesn't have that much HP, but it's more so niche than actually bad or completely unnecessary. Versus everyone. As a sackable unit with 4.2k DPS, area attack, and a 900C cost, she's good in just about every situation. 4.2k DPS stacks up really quickly, as just 2 would be dealing 8.4k DPS and just 3 would be dealing 12.6k DPS. These are some monstrous numbers, though again her 900C cost sets her back a lot, as there are plenty of replacements that'll be available to you that either do what she does already, but better, or they can do good enough while costing less and having other abilities that balance out aspects lost from Cyborg. I'll only be going through specific traits for a few of these cats, as a lot of the time a short analysis of how cats do generally is enough. In this instance though, I think it'd be a bit interesting to go into how a generalist does against specific traits, so here we go. Traitlist has way too much variety to definitively say if she'd be great against them or not, as we range from enemies like Master A with a range of 451 to little peons like those guys, to shorter range but still interesting enemies like Dober PD. Traitlist has anything, both very strong and very weak, and unlike just about all other traits, it just depends on what traitless enemy you're fighting. With Reds, we can actually qualify her effectiveness, and she fares pretty well, as the most prominent ones like Boar, JK Bun Bun, Shy Boy, and Cappy all have less than 350 range. Stacking many Paris cats in order to deal with different red threats is probably going to be very effective in most circumstances. Floating's a weird type as usually it's a secondary trait, but overall Paris would fare well assuming the trait is floating only, as she outranges all floating Bun variants and most Cyclones. Thanks to her toxic immune and the fact that Gobble always appears at 100% magnification, she'd only be taking 5k damage per hit from him. That means 2 hits before one of her 3 KBs are taken, so it's likely that your stack would stay if you can get rid of Gobble quickly. Though unless you already have a massive stack of undamaged cyborgs, I wouldn't rely on her to wipe Gobble off of the map. Aside from these enemies, the remaining floatings either outrange or would wipe her out so quickly that her possible performance against them doesn't matter, so her against floatings is more so hit or miss than actually good like Red's. She does extremely well against black enemies because of their high knockback count and generally low range. If it's possible to stack up a lot of cyborgs with a little support from cats like Bomber, then there's no way that just 4 of her wouldn't start wiping out your enemies. We all know she's not good versus metals and why. She can't deal with angels. There are a few of them she could wipe out, sure, but not most generally threatening ones. As for that, she'd only be good against Borfim. You might think at first that she'd be a nice wing piggy counter due to her immunity against Weaken, but this just isn't true, as even at 100% magnification, she does 8.1k DPS, has an Omni-Strike range of 340 both in front and behind, and has a standing range of 170. 8.1k DPS to a unit with 32.7k HP is just catastrophic, especially given her 3 knockbacks. Outside of this, it's just kind of worse as more dangerous angels like Angelic Sleipnir and Sunfish Jones in the right stages just outrange her hard. Aliens are known for their high range, and since Paris is 350 and not the highest HP, things for the most part are just awkward. While depending on the magnification, she could wipe Calamari out since she's immune to Weaken, that's about the only threatening alien she can beat aside from Naomi Boar and Bun Symbiote. She's not totally useless against aliens or anything, but I wouldn't suggest using her. Zombies are just a no. Even if the most common ones have low range, without ZK and their ability to burrow, you'll be losing stacks of Paris left and right, and given her steep cost of 900C on zombie stages, you'll have more than a hard time trying to get that money back. Relics and Akus can be kind of grouped together despite their vast differences because by now she shouldn't even be used. On the Relic side, most of the notable ones just flatly outrange her and would wipe her health pool out in seconds, and on the Aku side, their shields, surge ability, and generally extreme damage make her a confusing choice at best. Is she solid? Yeah, she's just pretty outdated and I find it hard to justify using her in both the mid SOL part of the game or past SOL or COTC parts. She's more of a legendary relic than anything. A unit that you used that was definitely integral, but there's an important time to permanently retire her due to age, meta change, and just better options. Jurassic. This cat's the prime critter that just about everyone will bring for future meta levels. Despite his seemingly low initial 5% crit chance, he at this point is good for fighting the occasional metal or in general circumstances if we're talking about when you first get him. Level 20. Cat sort of keeps his 5% crit chance, but he gains a boost to both attack power and health. By this point for generalist usage, he'd suck, but against metals, he's probably going to be literally your only option for wiping them out. Level 30. Catasaurus gains twice the HP and attack power by level 30 and a 7% crit chance, and he's still going to be your main metal critter, though he's still totally unusable in general situations due to its range, DPS, knockback count, and cost. Catasaurus maxed. At 50 plus 80 with maximum talents, he gains 54k HP or 18k HP per his 3 KBs and 5.8k DPS. His crit chance goes from 7% to 12%, he gains a 50% KB resistance, and a cost stun from 525C to 375C. Overall, these talents are meant to simply make him better at what he's already supposed to do, and with the overkill of 50 plus 80 and his 375C cost, he can slightly extend outside of just being a critter. Also, if he had an S level defense up against metals, he'd have 65k HP or 21k HP per his 3 KBs, but I won't be using that number for the rest of this section since it doesn't change all that much. Versus metals. Naturally, a unit that can possibly, at a high for this niche, 12% chance do 12k damage against metals is just insane. That's enough to one-shot every single common metal enemy assuming they're at 100% magnification, and enough to two-shot Sir Metal Seal. Plus, given his very solid HP, good survivability, and the fact that he outranges every single one of them, there's no way that he's not going to wipe out basically all metal threats that you have to face. And this isn't even putting into account the crit chance up cat combos you can get. Outside of rare scenarios, he's just going to be your best critter no matter what, especially with his super low 375C cost. His KB resistance only comes into play against Super Metal Hippo, as Catasaurus only outranges him by 10, and it'd probably do a good job at keeping him on top of that hard pusher. Versus General. A unit that has 54k HP, 5.8k DPS, and 180 range, and a cost of 375C would probably be usable in some scenarios generally, at least as a secondary meat shield if anything else, since these stats aren't anything to play around with. There are no other units that cost as much as him with a DPS value like that. Almost. We'll get to that later. And if we can get into a blind spot of an enemy or outrange them, it's not just going to be him, it'll be a stack. Plus, his 12% crit chance would definitely up his DPS a bit from 5.8k. So this is the only unit where crit chances actually would help with general usage outside of cameraman, or island, I guess. His only weakness is the fact that he's single target. Point is, if you want to, you can really make him work. His 3 knockbacks and his solid survivability only exist when fighting metal enemies though, since all common metals have lower range values than him, meaning that he'll always have a chance to keep trying to get those 12% crit chances off on them. So if you add him at this level, then that'd be something to keep in mind, as in general situations, he may have the same issue as someone like Axe or Viking, as in he won't really be able to get that high DPS value off, depending on who he's fighting due to that knockback count and range value. Is he solid? Without a doubt, yes. A 375C unit with 5.8k DPS and 54k HP is absolutely crazy already. But he's also a critter. He's definitely going to wipe out any metal enemies you have to face, and in general situations, like if you accidentally bring him into a loadout, or in stages without metals, he's still going to be a great melee unit with a chance to deal double damage. So really, his 5.8k DPS value is just assuming that he never crits. Either way, even though your Catasaurus isn't at 50 plus 80, aside from maybe one guy who's watching, investing in his talents will help you out a ton anyway when fighting metals. Definitely a top priority unit, and when pushed to his max, it becomes too powerful for the type he was created to counter. Viking. As one of the few Axe-Cat variants, how he's used is a bit predictable. Though he remains as one of the technically highest HP light tanks in the entire game, his knockbacks are hold him back in the eyes of most people. Level 20. Cat remains as a pretty solid option for defense in general situations, and especially against Reds and ELC and other very early parts of the game. With 9.1k HP or 3k HP per his 3KBs, he's going to be on the field for a nice amount of time with alright survivability. Though since he's not built like an island variant, his knockbacks work against him because of his low 1.2k DPS or 1k damage per hit, in comparison level 20 whales 2.1k damage per hit. Level 30. Once you get Maximum the Fighter, he gains area attack and a lot more HP, since now he has 26k or 8.6k HP per his 3KBs, and against Reds, he'd have 52k or 17k HP per his 3KBs. Compared to a lot of other defensive cats that are at his level, this is alright, though again because of his 3 knockbacks and his only alright DPS of 1.8k by this point, in a lot of situations he just won't be dealing much damage or taking much. Maximum maxed. Maximum at level 50 plus 80 with all talents becomes a monster. He'd have 86k or 28k HP per his 3KBs, and against Reds, he'd have 172k HP or 57k HP per his 3KBs. On top of this, his DPS becomes 5k, and against Reds, he'd do 7.6k DPS. And given his area attack, his stackability, and HP, this is actually really good. He'd also get immunity to slow and weaken, and a 70% resist against curse with the 50% resist against toxic. Overall, his talents help him majorly and kinda make him a monster, though again his 3 knockbacks are an issue. Having an 172k HP easily stackable meat shield against Reds, or just an 86k HP meat shield would be extremely strong, as it should be if you were to give him to this point, but his knockbacks make this whole thing flawed. Versus Reds. Of course against Reds, he's great as he was made to fight them. His effectiveness though depends mostly on if a red enemy could knock back Maximum with 57k damage continually, or if a red enemy could deal enough damage to immediately body his 172k HP, which depends on the red. Unsurprisingly though, not many Reds can actually do something crazy like that, so in most circumstances, Max is probably going to be your main defense against him once he's totally maxed. Thanks to his slow immunity, he can fight Professor A and actually gets hits off on him. Versus General. Really, for general situations, it just depends on if he'd be juggled or not. It's entirely possible that due to his 28k HP per his 3 knockbacks, that he'd just be pushed back too quickly to be more useful or on par with simply dual erasers. In fact, that HP value is about the same as a max level eraser since he has 26k HP by 20 plus 90. So at best, he either won't be knocked back at all, or he'll effectively beat 3 erasers for a slightly higher cost than just spawning 3 erasers, which would be 450C. In other scenarios where his immunities and resistances come into play, he's alright. First off, his curse resistance is probably going to be totally useless, as relics usually do very high damage and it'd only be useful anyway if reds are also present. As for toxic resistance, there are no enemies that are red that even have toxic abilities, and the only common enemies that you'll be fighting with the toxic ability are Gobble and Zolo, which doesn't happen too often, and due to how they both attack, Maximum's probably barely going to get any hits in. Meat shields aren't usually important for wiping either of these enemies out either because of their ability, and because you can destroy them both easily with Fishman. Both of these resistances are situational, and his immunities are also just alright. Weakened immunity doesn't make too much sense since within his niche, nobody aside from special enemies like Bearsby Back, Red Wind, Baron Seal, and Hanya even have that ability. But when it comes to slow immunity, this was clearly only given to him so he could fight Professor A. Outside of this, it's just similarly worthless, and even against Professor A, given his high DPS, it's possible that he'd just juggle max because of his high knockback count. If he'd be juggled, don't use him. If not, then he'll still function as a properly powerful light tank, but the fact that a light tank can be juggled is already a show that this unit has a lot of issues. Is he solid? Versus Reds, absolutely. 172k total HP and 57k HP per 3 KBs with 7.6k DPS, all for 525C, and a pretty low cooldown is incredible. Outside of his niche though, Max suffers as a lot of his stats become pretty mid, specifically due to his knockback count. So just focus on using Max maxed out against Reds, or just invest in Ro instead. Pirate, easily one of the most neutral cats in the game. Pirate possesses the ability to knock back Reds at a 30% chance at 270 range. Early game as a range attacker, this is alright, but quickly he becomes, again, more neutral than anything. Level 20. All he gains is a slight HP and DPS increase. Aside from that, he's effectively the same, just with a far worse attack animation. Level 30. Dread Pirate gains a substantial buff to his HP, going from 4.2k to 15.3k between forms, 300 range, and a 40% chance to knock back Reds. Overall, he's still just alright for what he does. Knocking Reds back isn't really the kind of skill you look for when you have to fight them, especially since there are so many other better ways to deal with them, be that by knocking them back with other units or simply using other abilities against them. Dread Pirate Catley maxed. With 50.6k HP or 16.9k HP per his 3 KBs and 1.6k DPS, he sure does exist. The most interesting thing about this unit are his talents, as they basically change up his role. He gains a 100% survive chance, a 70% slow resistance, and wave immunity, which was intended to make him a wave immune secondary meat shield. Versus Reds. None of these talents really change what he already does aside from making his survivability better, unless we're talking about Berserker Cory. It lets Dread Pirate survive his stage-wide wave and Berserker Cory at 5 speed and 160 range versus Dread Pirate's 300 range and 40% KB chance, easy stackability, wave immunity, and high attack speed makes him a perfect candidate for keeping Berserker Cory away forever. But outside of this unique interaction, he might only be useful against Toucan, though due to his 240 range and 10 movement speed, it's less dependable. Versus General, don't do it. Look, a 300 range attacker isn't enough to push me from using them. It's just the fact that his DPS is so pitiful. DPS like this is only acceptable if that's their standing range and they have an LD range of 275 through 500-ish, like Bubble or something. Versus Waivers. As a secondary waving meat shield, he'd probably be pretty good. 300 range is comfortable enough to probably be less than your ranged units, and his 50.6k HP with 3 knockbacks gives him some nice survivability for his sorta awkward cost of 510c. Plus, even if a waiver somehow one-shots Dread Pirate Catley, he has a 100% chance to survive, so at the very least he's gonna survive 2 hits. Obviously I don't have Catley at this level, but I can't imagine him as anything other than a solid anti-wave meat shield that'd be powerful when used in tandem with normal anti-wave meat shields and or anti-wave attackers. Plus his low DPS might become noticeable for chipping waivers down, though that might be stretching things. Is he solid? Probably. I feel like more than other cats on this list, thinking about how good he'd be at maximum abilities is way more assumption based, as this is a pretty unique role that not many other units have, so I don't have much to reference from. Thief. One of the most disliked cats in the game, starts off as a sort of fast, alright melee attacker with the ability to get you double the money against aliens once they die. Level 20. Though he's one of my favorite cats and always has been, it's unlikely that you continue using him for much longer after this point, as you'd probably have some better options. His double bounty ability is still really good for if you're fighting some weak melee enemies, but aside from that, he'd most likely be replaced by someone like Thor or Whale. Level 30. Even though he gains 200 range and area attack, he's still only useful at this point for his ability to wipe peons out so you can get some extra cash. Unless you're like me and he's one of your favorite cats in the game too, there's zero reason to use this guy outside of highly niche scenarios. Goman maxed. Goman kinda becomes a monster once he's totally maxed, and he's one of the only cats that has a video that already exists about this by Chillhola, though it doesn't really go into depth about how good he can be in other scenarios. With 30.4k HP or 10.1k HP per 3k Vs and 5.4k DPS given his cost, this is pretty insane. But it gets crazier, as he also gains 23 movement speed and a 150% strengthen ability with ZK. Due to his 150% strengthen at 33% HP, this means that on his third knockback, he'd be dealing 13.5k DPS. Given his high speed, high DPS, and double bounty, he genuinely becomes a force to be reckoned with in the correct situations. Versus zombies. Given his range, attack speed, damage, and possibly his strengthen ability, a few of him would probably be in more than enough to wipe out all common zombie enemies that are still threatening, and a few bigger enemies like Lord Gravy, Zoosh, however you say that, Dreadboar, or Zappy, if he has some meat shielding. Because of his 23 movement speed, he'd also have a great chance at dealing damage to slow attacking zombies like Ariat, or getting into the blind spots of enemies like Death Angel Z Ono. Even though there are a few enemies that would wipe the floor with Gomon at this absurd level like Zemel, Cadaver Bear, or Engaburu to name a few, he'd still be really good against zombies, especially given the correct support. Versus General. I think that Goman would be the best for getting into blind spots of enemies like Henry and Waylon, or for fighting enemies that attack slowly like the Sloth, Sunfish Jones, and Lenore, and it's because of his high speed and 200 range. 200 range is extremely awkward, and it's basically melee range. And since he doesn't have the most health in the world at 30.4k or flat out insane damage in usual circumstances, he probably still wouldn't do all that great against the likes of blind spotless enemies with more than 200 range. This makes his usage, even at this level, very awkward and kind of similar to using a version of UFO with more HP and less damage. Goman for sure isn't a bad unit outside of fighting zombies or anything, but using him as if he's a regular rusher like Fishman or a regular tackler like Cameraman just wouldn't work. Is he solid? Nah. His potential against zombies is great, sure, but outside of that, he's a unit you'd probably only use against slow attacking enemies, LD enemies, or maybe a few other niche scenarios. And this is just him at absolute max. Using him on the road there is even more awkward since Goman just isn't a good cat despite his potential. So really, if you're thinking about maxing out Goman, then I wouldn't say that you should. Bishop. Bishop later becomes one of the most powerful and important debuffers in the entire game against floating and angel enemies, but at the start they kinda suck. Like most of the cats during this point where you'd be restricted to their first form, Bishop's usable, but he's not standout by any metric. Level 20. Once he becomes Monk Cat, not much changes. In the super early game, his low single target 200 attack range and QWERTY HP at only 5.2k leaves a lot to be desired, not to mention his naturally horrible DPS since he's a CC unit after all. In EOC, he's outranging no floating enemies, and afterwards in something like SOL, he wouldn't be much of a help. Level 30. By level 30, Sanzo finally becomes useful. He's given 250 range and area attack with the same slowing chance, and honestly, this change is massively helpful for him. His abilities as a slowing debuffer against floating enemies are solid thanks to his fast attack rate despite the seemingly low 20% chance, and his great survivability can't be ignored. Versus floating. With Sanzo at level 30, you'd be outranging the most relevant floating enemies such as Bonbon variants, most of the Cyclones, Shy Boys, Brawlos, and a few rare enemies like Vlad D. Staple. With the floatings he can't outrange, there wouldn't be that much benefit in slowing them down, since they're mostly enemies like the Face, Muth variants, and Super Backliners. Overall, Sanzo by this point is good enough as a great anti-floating slower for when you need to seriously hinder the movement of floating enemies. And this is especially great because they usually come in groups, so the area attack definitely comes into play a lot of the time. Sanzo maxed. At 50 plus 80 with max talents, Sanzo gains 37.2k HP or 12.4k HP per 3k Bs and 3.3k DPS stat wise. He'd also gain a 5-second slow instead of a 4-second one, targeting against angels, the ability to weaken targeted traits by 30% at a 30% chance for 4 seconds, and a 50% chance to survive lethal strikes. Only thing I have to say about the talents is that his survive chance feels slightly tacked on, but it's definitely not an unwelcome upgrade as it could definitely save your stack of Sanzos and thus save your position on the field. Versus floating. With his slightly usable DPS, weaken ability by 30%, and his survive chance, he alone can become a force to be reckoned with as he'd be dealing an AoE of 3.3k DPS while weakening and slowing all enemies that float. He's also very spammable, so this DPS is absolutely going to stack and it'll be noticeably helpful for when you're sending units alongside Sanzo. His HP and lack of immunity to very specific things like Curse, Toxic, or Surges don't let him have any serious new matchups, so enemies like Gobble and the zombie anglerfish are gonna wipe him out. I think it's Ingaburu. But that's barely even a point against maxed out Sansa. You get an attacker that's spammable, can weaken your enemies like 30% for 4 seconds and slow them for 5 at the same time, and they're perfect against all relevant enemies they need to slow down. Really, what more can you ask for? The only issue is if there's another unit that can weaken at a higher percent, like Octo for example. Then in that case, Sansa's weaken would be detrimental, but it's still a useful thing for a CC unit to possibly provide 2 debuffs at the same time. And this is kind of a similar story for Angels. Versus Angels. Angels is a very interesting type for Sansa to gain the target of, because his ability to counter them is similar to Floatings, but he can't counter some of the strongest and most notable Angel enemies. Though for the most part, he's still going to be the guy you pick. With Angels, he can easily slow and weaken their Cyclones, their common enemies, and their Boar, though he's helpless against Sleipnir, Chick-fil-A, Calamaria, and Winged Piggy, which are 4 of the most dangerous Angels in the entire game. His abilities are still solid when he can work. Again, 3.3k DPS with the ability to slow and weaken for so long when stacked isn't a joke, so overall, he's still a great help against Angels, and the talent is especially welcome because he's probably going to be the one who you use to counter the Angelic Cyclone. Versus Generalist. In a vacuum, it just depends on the range of your enemies. You can definitely use a Scout with his 3.3k DPS in general situations because again, his spam ability and his AoE attacking abilities. Plus, if in mixed stages you have to fight some floating or angel enemies, his support will definitely be welcome. But outside that vacuum, just use any other attacker. Is he solid? Absolutely. That DPS isn't a joke, and his abilities to debuff is really good. Though for him to be effective, there's no reason to go this far with Sansa even if he becomes a solid attacker with already HP on top of everything that he can already do. Simply going for a level 30 Sansa with weaken and angel target is all you'll ever need. It's been a while, so let's take a second and read another verse from the Bible. 1 John 5:21. Dear children, keep away from things that might take God's place in your hearts. It's simple. Keep God as a core of your life and push away things that take away from that. Do this as soon as possible and I promise that you'll find a new peace and hope. Fortune Teller. Fortune has 240 range and even lower DPS than most other CC units that you may be using generally during this extremely early point of the game. Later on he becomes kind of strange as he's mostly known for being too good at what he sets out to do while also not being enough. Level 20. Aside from gaining a little more attack power, he's basically the exact same. His knockback chance at 30% and attack speed makes him a really good floating knockbacker for those he can hit safely, but I'll talk more about this later. Level 30. Now his HP basically doubles and he gets a little more attack power, and he gains a 40% chance of knock floating enemies back. With 270 range and his high attack speed, he's already extremely good at pushing back a small set of floatings like all the floating Bun Bun variants, Cyclones, and maybe a few other niche enemies. Despite the fact that his HP was doubled, it's still a horrible 12.8k, so even as soon as you get his true form, this won't help much. It's also likely that he might knock back too well and cause your attackers to clip into the enemies he can knock back, and because of this, some people prefer to use his Fisherman form instead of this. Dr. Cat maxed. With 42k HP or 14.2k HP per 3 KBs, he's already basically the exact same. His talents give him a 50% resistance against knockback, 70% resistance to curse, and the ability to target relics, and well, all this only makes him slightly better. Versus relics. While his KB ability is phenomenal to a fault, the thing about relics is the fact that they have both extremely high damage and DPS, and that most of them have annoyingly high range. So the only unit that makes sense if you want to use them are Old Horn and Primeval Cyclone. Strikingly limited, and given his actually in the situation bad 42k HP and 14.2k HP per 3 knockbacks versus relics, and his resistance instead of immunity to curse makes using Doctor against them an absolute joke. The only way you could use him against threatening pushers that aren't Old Horn is if you freeze your enemies with something like Naga. Given his incredible ability to knock back, he'll definitely be able to do it maybe twice against someone like Most or Relic Bun Bun, assuming your timing is perfect. Thinking about it more, this is all due to how the cat's constructed, as even if he targeted any other trait aside from zombies, his ability wouldn't have worked well because of his range. Is he solid? No. Doctor's already a super niche cat. His relic targeting barely helps him, and his other talents don't give him some kind of new niche like Dread Pirate Catly or almost journalist capabilities like Sansa. Shaman. There's a reason why Shaman is always the cat used in memes or joke images where a player rolls for an Uber, but in the end they get this cat every time. Level 20. He gains a slight HP buff, but it's the kind that doesn't matter. With a 20% chance to deal 2-second freeze to floating at 250 range, a cost of 510 C, and single target attack, he's alright against them. The chance is very low, and the 2-second freeze isn't that great, but since you wouldn't have someone like Sanzo right now, as he'd probably be Monk with 50 lower range and the ability to slow, this is the best that you've got. Against the only important floating during this point, as in Bun Bun, the chance of him actually slowing him down due to only having 50 range over him and a single target is extremely low. Level 30, 300 range and a 3-second freeze instead of a 2-second one. Though the extra 50 range sounds like it'll add a lot, it really just helps him stay safe from the enemies he could already target like Bun Bun variants and Cyclones, and it doesn't give him any new enemies he can fight. Necro Dancer maxed. At best, he'd have 20.8k HP or 6.9k HP per his 3k Bs and 2.3k DPS. On top of this, he gains a 30% chance to perform a level 2 wave, immunity to toxic, and a 70% freeze resistance. These talents only kind of help him, with the only notable one being his wave chance, as his HP is so low that having a freeze resistance or immunity to toxic will only be helpful in absurdly niche scenarios. Though you'd think his wave would help him get freezes off, as the wiki says, the chance of him to freeze and for him to use his waves are separate, meaning that he only has a 6% chance for both of them to activate. So even though he can technically hit enemies like Albros, Moots, and the faces for a few examples, he only has a 6% chance to actually freeze them for only 3 seconds from this range. The obvious, most likely thing that'll happen is that he hits the enemies in front of the targeted floating. The enemy dies because of your other attackers, and he gets hit by that very enemy floating because of his bad HP, and he dies. Is he a waver? If Shaman has a level 2 wave and he deals 2.3k DPS at this level or 4.2k damage per wave, this means that he'd deal 4.2k single target damage first and then that same damage twice. So he'd deal a total of 12.6k damage or 8.4k damage for all the other enemies that are hit by both his waves. This means that if he can get a wave every single time against a single enemy, he'd have 7k DPS, or in the second best case scenario, he'd have 4.7k DPS. This sounds kind of strong, especially given his 300 range and sort of easy stackability, but it's only kind of strong when you stack him because of the low 30% wave chance. Even though he attacks quickly, this just isn't effective or dependable damage in comparison to just other waivers or regular attacking mid-rangers. Because of this, even the thing that might have given him some form of generalist value is effectively useless unless he has the best case possible luck, which is certainly impossible. Is he solid? No. Necrodancer's HP, even when Ultramax, is so terrible that if he's grazed, he died. His niche is completely wiped by Sanzo as well, who's just good enough and even better in most scenarios, with the 50 range difference not mattering at all since that doesn't even give Necro any advantages aside from a bit more safety. Basically, Necro's the definition of outclassed by Sanzo, which, as one of the most mid cats in the entire game, her at the time and forever mid abilities remain completely unnotable. Level 20. Aside from a small HP and damage buff, nothing changes. Her ability to slow res at a 20% chance with an auto attack speed remains a thing that she can do, as with only 200 range at level 20, she's not going to get much usage. Level 30. With a very small increase to HP, her stats aside from her range becoming 250 don't change. The only notable enemies that she can slow are Shy Boy, Boar, and JK Bun Bun. Enchantress maxed. She gains 37k HP or 12.4k HP per her 3 knockbacks and 1.8k DPS. On top of this, she obtains a 50% survive chance, an extra second to her slowing ability, and targeting towards zombies. Versus zombies. Her slowing ability against zombies is solid as she only costs 495 C, has a 50% survive chance, and she outranges all common zombies you could think of. Though, since this is the slow ability at a 20% chance, her role isn't very striking or special even when hypermaxed, as she remains a highly replaceable unit even within her own rarity. Is she solid? No, which has always been one of my least favorite cats because she's bland and useless. And even at absurd levels, she's still not useful. If you're a fan of Enchantress, maybe at max get her survivability and nothing more. Archer, the most costly, highest range, and overall infamous gacha rare in the game, Archer Cat is very interesting to say the least. While in the far past he was clowned on for being one of the worst cats in the game due to his cost and low damage even against his targeted traits, he'd go on to be a pretty strong unit against both of his targets. Level 20. For now, he's Cupid Cat. Though he has 340 range, he costs a staggering 1230 C and only has 490 DPS. In the super early game, there's only like 2 floating enemies you have to fight, those being Bun Bun and the Face. So most of the time, you'd be using this guy against other traits. Assuming you're fighting either of those guys though, he'd be dealing 1.9k DPS. Dragon has way better HP at 9.6k versus Cupid's 2.8k. The only drawback to Dragon was the fact that he costs 1500 C, so he's slightly more expensive. But that's completely worth it as he outclasses Cupid completely, and instead of Cupid becoming the main thing used against Bun Bun despite his MDB floating, it's Dragon. Level 30. Now Cupid becomes Cator. He gains some more HP, 6.1k HP to be exact, and his natural DPS shoots up to 1k, or 4.1k against floatings. Even before any investments, he's already pretty solid against floatings during this point of the game, thanks to a solid range. Versus floating. Against floating enemies, his range, speed, and costs are all pretty fair. He's a solid pick for things like the early Cyclones, green cat fruit stages, or simply against floating enemies in early SOL because of his fair DPS and range. Versus Generalist. Against other traits, there's just no reason to use him because of his high cost for his low natural DPS. It's more optimal to use someone like Dragon or by this point Cameraman despite their lower range. Cator maxed. At 50 plus 80 with max talents, Cator gains 18k HP or 6.2k HP per 3 KBs, and a natural 3.1k DPS. Against his targeted enemies though, he'd deal 12.7k DPS or 30.5k damage per hit. He gains the ability to target zombies and zombie killer, and finally his recharge time is reduced by 2 seconds. These are all pretty good talents that make Cator better at what he's made to do, which was destroy floatings with highly spammable DPS and a reasonable cost. On top of this, he gains a new niche against zombies, which is alright because there aren't that many long-range zombie attackers that are actually solid. Versus zombies. Cator's DPS against his targeted types is amazing. He still has pretty bad health though, as 18k with no defensive abilities versus a type that's mostly stat based is rough to deal with. And zombies burrow, so it's fully possible that they'd intercept Cator during his long force swing animation, and at least knock him back. But it's possible that they die, as zombies like Stories or Zeal's Z-Krako and Zooch have very high DPS and burrow either pretty far or in by an annoying amount like Z-Krako, who most likely burrow on top of your backliners or mid-rangers while dealing a natural 8.3k DPS. A single target can also be a big issue, as there can be a zombie that's encroaching, but instead of your Cator attacking the zombie, another could burrow and take a hit or two. Or really anything could happen and ruin your hits. Just know that even with these issues, the DPS and 390 range is still very powerful. He outranges all commonly appearing zombie enemies, Cadaver Bear, Zappy, Ariat, Lil Zyklone, and Lord Gravy. The only notable one that he can't outrange is Amel. If you're on a stage where you can get Cator to survive a little while, with this, you're definitely going to be hurting the enemies badly. Honestly, by this point, a great cat versus this specific niche despite a few flaws. Versus floating. Weird to say, but I think Cator against floating is worse than zombies. For starters, a lot of floating enemies either come in packs, have solid range and speed, and they have secondary types, which makes Cator's role against them, especially with the single target and high cost, less valuable than with zombies. The only ones Cator would be effective against in a vacuum are Muth, Albro, Lil Bun Bun, Brawlo, The Face, most of the Cyclones, and Angaburu if his surge never hits him. The main issue with Cator against floating enemies though is that unlike a lot of other cats, it's impossible to stay within a vacuum because its niche is filled so much better by other anti-floatings. On 4-star, this and Cameraman are definitely your guys for floating enemies, no doubt, but outside of that, why wouldn't you use Fisherman for the sheer insane damage alone? If we granted Fisherman the exact same max stat, he at max stats and talents would be doing 179k damage per hit or 44.4k DPS effectively. Cator is more of an awkward choice as opposed to a flat out bad one versus floatings, with two main obvious replacements, that being Fishman for his insane damage and rushing ability, and Cameraman for her stack ability, low cost and high DPS, not to mention her generalist capabilities. Why wouldn't you just stick to using him versus zombies? Versus generalist. Occasionally, as you saw, I go into how they'd probably do against other traits. Overall though, it's kind of the same thing again and again. If you need a 400 range attacker, then use a dragon variant instead. Talents don't even make Cator generally viable, they just make his DPS kind of comfortable, as if there are some simple level 30 collab backliner. Unlike Thief, who's way more interesting with talents, or Rocker as you'll see later, there's generally zero reason to use them outside of their niche. Is he solid? Yeah, against the specific types. He can do great numbers if he survives for a while against floating enemies and zombies. Outside of that, not so much. Big question here is, should you start investing in CATLANTIS? Well, it's unlikely that you'll ever get a 50 plus 80 max talented CATLANTIS anytime soon, no matter where you are in the game right now. I'd say that it's a fair choice to go for it. Seriously, my 50 plus 33 talent maxed aside from defense of CATLANTIS has helped me against zombies and floating enemies a lot. I don't regret investing that much into him, but really, this is one of those units where it just depends on if you want to go for it or not, depending on where you are in the game. Swordsman. Yes, I get it. Courier cat wipes, right? I personally think it's more complex than that. Early game, he's the guy you're going to turn to if you want to wipe out reds, and he does a great job at it. Level 20. By now you'd have Swordmaster Cat with 4.8k DPS against red enemies and his 155 range. He'd actually do a pretty good job at fighting them, as he would have most likely only encountered Sir Seal, One Horn, Bee Bunny, and Piggy, and only 2 of those enemies barely outrange him. Even then, if he's fighting a Sir Seal, his RA HP of 7.8k or 2.6k per his 3k bees with some meat shielding is definitely enough to keep him alive. Against non-reds though, he'd be okay with the natural DPS of 1.2k and 1.3k damage per hit. Though due to his few shortcomings, it'd probably be a better idea to bring along other cats instead. Level 30. Now you'd be dealing with 17k HP or 5.6k HP per his 3k Bs and 3k DPS or 12k DPS versus reds. Despite his low range, early on for things like SOL and the growing red stages, this would definitely be a go-to unit assuming you can get some kind of slowing or freezing strategy going against your enemies. For general situations, so a 3k DPS and 155 range at this time of the game, it'd be better to use basically anyone else. Elemental Duelist Cat maxed. At his complete max, he'd have 56.4k HP or 18k HP per his 3k Bs. His damage though becomes pretty insane. With a natural DPS of 10.2k and his new target angels, he'd have 41k DPS. I have to compare him to Courier and Mushroom though, as they're in the same niche. Respectively at max abilities, Courier versus Reds does 21k DPS and Mushroom does 15.7k DPS. Though Elemental blows both of them out of the water by an insane amount in the DPS department, he has the weakness of having very low range, too many knockbacks, and not enough HP or defensive abilities to back that up. Elemental is way better damaging wise if you're fighting Reds or Angels with very short ranges, or if you can get a very consistent freeze on both of them. But Courier and Mushroom are better for more situations despite their DPS being miles lower. Overall though, it really depends on who you're fighting and if you can utilize that DPS. There are definitely niche scenarios where Elemental Duelists at max abilities break levels, but those situations are of course niche, not the standard. Versus Reds. Swordmaster's DPS is absolutely insane. If you can effectively use him against Reds with some kind of freezing strategy, then he'd melt. But that's a big if, and it depends heavily on if the stage is red focused or mixed. This is because the only enemies that Swordmaster can outrange are Red Cyclone, One Horn, Bee Bunny, Ginger Snake, Boar, Piggy, and Shy Boy just barely. It's possible though that with his spammability and low cost, you could be melting enemies by just meat shielding and sending him out. As if he can just stack a bit versus an occasionally frozen red enemy, he'd be doing 45.1k damage per hit. Versus Angels. Giving Swordmaster the ability to target Angels was a pretty bad choice. They do immense damage overall, so even if Swordmaster was getting some hits in, he'd probably get knocked back, and they're fast, so it's unlikely that his DPS will actually be able to set in. He outranges 0 Angels except for Gabriel, Divine Cyclone, and Mini Angel Cyclone, so the only way you're going to be able to use them effectively is if you're constantly freezing them. And again, similarly to Reds, this is assuming you're in an angel only stage. Even if you pit him against someone like Sunfish Jones or the cruel angel Kleinel, I guess, the only other angels that are definitely going to be accompanying them is going to wipe him out anyway. If not, those very long range enemies themselves. Outside of super niche scenarios, the angel target even at max is just bad if you don't somehow get crazy freezes off on your angel only stages. Good luck using Juliet. Is he solid? As I said earlier, in niche scenarios, yes. Occasionally you'll find use with him and he'll be great, but overall, he's not. High DPS on paper, not so great in practice because of his aforementioned glaring weaknesses. Range is extremely important, and if Swordsmaster had just gotten a range up talent or an increased range from 155 to 230 even, he'd most likely be noticed for his crazy potential DPS. It's unfortunate, but that's just how it is. Cat Gunslinger. A forever unremarkable cat that has the ability to slow down black enemies at a 30% chance. In the very start, he might be your first mid-ranger, but outside of that, there's not much. Level 20. As usual, he gains a small attack buff and HP buff, but nothing more. Level 30, he goes from 290 to 320 range, gains a small HP and defense buff, but nothing more. The ability to slow black enemies is alright if you really need it, though his 30% chance is kind of awkward at times, and his lack of area attack when fighting black enemies hurts him a lot. The amount of time you'll face swarms of dark doges and shadow box or Ks is just absurd, and this guy definitely won't be helping you against that. Cat Gunslinger maxed. As usual for a CC unit, his damage and HP doesn't get too crazy, as he only has 25.9k HP with 8.6k HP per his 3kbs and 2.2k DPS. At his maximum possible best, he'd still be wiped out easily by the groups he targets, though his abilities add a whole new niche. He gains the ability to target relics, a 70% resistance to curse, and an extremely weak 0.67 seconds recovery speed up. Overall, strange choices for talents aside from relic targeting. I mean, why not give him curse immunity, right? It's not like he, with 25k HP, is gonna survive a few hits from relics anyway, and his recovery speed barely matters. Versus relics. The only interesting thing to talk about is how he fares against relics. With this, he can only slow down a few enemies like Old Horn, and he can barely slow M. Ost and Relic Bun Bun. And if any of those enemies hit him, he's either already dead or is at half health. It's still a very necessary talent to get if you have nothing else to fight relics with, but when you're at a point where you have a nice amount of anti-relics, he only becomes alright, I guess. Is he solid? Against blacks? No. Against relics? He's good against the very few that he can target, but outside of that, no. Never ever invest in all of his talents if you were for some reason thinking about it, and only get his relic target talent so he can have an easier time fighting Old Horns and Emosts. Stilts. They start off bad, as even at the very start, they have very low damage and HP. Plus there aren't any angels that exist yet, so the 30% chance of knockback angels doesn't matter. Level 20. They gain an extremely tiny HP and damage increase and nothing more. Level 30. They gain some more damage, a 30% now to 50% chance of KB angels, and a lot more HP, but no range increases. Literally the only angels they can knock back are the common ones, Raja Kong and the angelic cyclones in Borfum, so it's unlikely that you'll be using them often. Acrobat Cat's maxed. 550 plus 80, he gains 44.8k HP or 14.9k HP per his 3kbs and 2.9k DPS. As for his abilities, he gains a 30% chance to inflict a level 1 surge that can spawn from 400 to 700 range, immunities to waves, and a 70% resistance against freeze. His most interesting ability is Surge, as you might think it could turn him into an alright Surge unit or something. I tried this a very long time ago, and no, it doesn't. Not even at this level. The level 1 Surge will only do Acrobat's damage within a random area of 400 to 700 range for area attacking damage once. So he'll hit whoever once, and then 7.4k damage once again, and maybe another knockback if you're fighting angels. It's terrible. It's terrible for him to already just copy his naturally horrible damage one time. Definitely is not going to affect his DPS, and of course the spawning range is just abysmal. Versus angels. Needing a stepping stone to maybe hit angels like Sleipnir, Chick-fil-A, and Calamaria is at best unreliable, and that'd all be for a single knockback. At best, you'll get 2 knockbacks on angels and nothing else. Is he solid? No, and for very simple reasons. His weird surge from 400 to 700 doesn't help him, as his main issues are his 310 range and his very low damage. Talents don't save him, and even at max, he's not very good outside of specific situations, like when fighting the angelic cyclone or something. Tin Cat. Easily the strangest Gacha Rare cat. Tin Cat has 295 range and a 50% chance to knock back black enemies. Early on, you'd probably use him for his range, though that role's pretty replaceable. Level 20. He goes from 8 to 15 movement speed and gains some more attack and defense, though nothing else changes. Level 30. He gains a nice HP buff and slightly higher damage, plus he goes from 295 range to a nice 345 range, though he gets a reduction in movement speed from 15 to 10. This buff would be great if he wasn't a CC unit that only knocks back blacks at a 50% chance. That's what keeps him from being useful, since sure, black enemies generally have some high HP, but they already have a lot of knockbacks. Plus the fact that he has single target, and he'd have to deal with a trait that almost always comes in crowds, makes him so much worse. Robo-Cat maxed. He gains 50.7k HP or 16.8k HP per his 3kbs and 3k DPS, and he gains the ability to dodge black enemies at a 20% chance for 1.67 seconds, immunity to knockback himself, and a 70% resistance to curse. There's not many places to take a unit that's constructed around such a bad idea, especially the resistance to curse, as black enemies with supporting relics don't appear all too often, and even if Robo-Cat got cursed, it's not like his ability is so worthwhile that it'd make a massive change to the fight. His immunity to knockback also makes zero sense since no black enemies have the ability to knockback, unless tertiary meat shielding. Robo-Cat has high range and HP for what he does, so it's possible to use him as kind of a meat shield for your higher range units just in case. He could easily defend someone like Dragon or other super backliners like Satoru and function as another layer of defense just in case. And I think that this is what his dodge chance was trying to do, as just in case black enemies cut in too hard, you have a 20% chance to get 1.67 seconds of guaranteed safety from them pushing. This is actually a really unique and interesting role since there are basically no meat shields or light tankers with a range this high. As the closest one I can think of is Calligraphy Cat at 330 range. The Calligraphy Cat has far less HP than him at this level. On top of this, his immunity to knockback could help him keep in place longer if your enemy doesn't do enough damage to KB him quickly. So overall, he'd probably be a really good cat for this niche. Is he solid? No. That's him at maximum abilities. So that's you getting him 80 times, spending 25 rare cat's eyes and 370 NP for a tertiary meat shield that, while seems good from my assumption, isn't good enough for that kind of absurd investment. Rocker. Rocker starts off as a great tanker with fine damage even though there aren't any angels in the early game. He's a simple but effective unit. Level 20. He gains a lot of extra HP and a little more DPS but nothing more. Level 30. Cat gains 17k HP and a little more damage with 3k DPS. Against angels, he'd have 71.4k HP, and since there are basically no other angel tankers, this guy's gonna be your best bet when defending against them. Cat maxed. 550 plus 80 with max talents, Ramen gains 59.2k HP and 10.1k DPS. Against angels, he'd have 236.8k HP. Absolutely absurd numbers, though his other talents only give him a 70% resistance against curse and slow, and a 50% resistance against knockback. As a stat-based unit, it 100% makes sense that his stats are this crazy, and I don't even have to explain why a semi-spammable 315C unit with 59.2k HP and 10.1k DPS is incredible versus angels. There's no doubt that no matter what, you're going to be using him against all angel enemies. A 315C unit with 236.8k HP and 10k DPS is just absurd, and with his reduction in knockback, he can better fight off and defend your other cats from Sleipnir. The only way that this cat wouldn't be useful against angels is if their damage is so insane that somehow 236.8k HP isn't enough to help them, or if you're fighting relics with angels at the same time. Even with the 70% reduction to the time he's cursed, if he's not being constantly hit by relics, he should be fine. Versus Generalists. 59.2k HP is pretty solid as a light tanker for his 1 knockback and extremely low cost. Whether or not his high DPS will factor in depends on if he survives for a long time, since each of his hits only does 3.3k damage. So he'd at least have to be alive so his damage can actually sink in. Is he solid? Yeah. He's a simple stat-based light tank with high DPS when super leveled, and once you get him up here, angels won't ever be a problem again. Mer-cat. While this cat starts off as genuinely terrible, later on it becomes one of the best go-to mid-game options if you want to fight basically anyone. And by terrible, I really do mean it. 190 range, 4 knockbacks, only alright damage, extremely slow speed, and the fact that floating enemies basically don't exist in the game make her totally useless, since even at this point in the game, you'd have superior options. Level 20. While she gains some HP and damage just like everyone else, she still is a horrible unit with every pitfall she had previous. It's mostly the melee level range, 4KBs, and slow speed that does it for her. Level 30. With a big range buff going from 190 to 250, area attack, and some more HP, she actually becomes a solid stackable unit with high survivability. Who knew that just 3 simple tweaks would make this unit great, as now she can function as a secondary defensive meat shield of sorts thanks to her high range, and her alright damage allows her to push and get some chip damage in. Cameraman maxed. At max, she'd have 32.1k HP or 8k HP per her 4KBs and 5.3k DPS. Against floating enemies though, she'd have 64.2k HP or 16k HP per her 4KBs and 7.9k DPS. As for her abilities, she gains a 2% crit chance, a 100% chance to survive lethal strikes, and a 50% reduction to wave damage. Versus floating. There's almost no reason not to bring Cameraman unless you're fighting someone like Gobble, Albros, Loki, or other floatings that she'd never be able to get to. A 540C unit that's easy to stack with 7.9k DPS and high HP for 250 range is a must-have in most floating encounters. Plus, with her survivability, she could probably survive if floating enemies are pushing super hard, since as they're pushing, there's still going to be a lot of cameramans that'll be clipping them. Versus metals. With her crit damage at this level being 37.2k, there's no way that she wouldn't instantly kill every single metal that'd be hit with something like this. Though the chance at a measly 2% isn't high enough to be dependable, and the only reason she's seen as a critter by some is because she can outrange all common metal enemies and is therefore easily stackable against them. Camera doesn't hurt a metal loadout, I don't think, but it just makes more sense to bring your usual anti-metals instead of camera because, again, a 2% chance is super pitiful. She's more of a unit that can crit like Manic Island and Cat Quest heroes, but she's not a critter like Catasaurus and Cat Typhoon. Versus Journalist. Cam's a classic Journalist usage due to all the aforementioned reasons. Outside of stages where high speed is important, or where you're fighting a high range, fast attacking enemy like Kamel, her 250 range and low speed in comparison to most cats is going to be a massive help in your defensive, as stacks of her will be very dense and powerful if enemies start pushing quickly. Not to mention the fact of her survivability again, because enemies might be stuck on the same 2 or 3 cameras for a few hits before being able to progress to your base. And through that, there's no way they're not going to be taking some notable damage. Is she solid? Without a doubt, yes. Probably the most solid rare on the entire list in fact. With her high HP, great survivability, and solid range, she's going to be helpful in just about every scenario in some way. Second break, let's enjoy another verse from the Bible. John 7:38. Anyone who believes in me may come and drink, for the scriptures declare rivers of living water will flow from his heart. It's interesting that he repeated this reference to the living water he said he'd give to the Samaritan woman in the crowd. The most interesting part of it though was the crowd's reaction. Some understood him correctly as the Messiah, but others didn't and wanted him to be arrested. And I think that this describes how people see him today, as some still don't see him as God, or they hate him and what he represents due to misunderstanding him. John 7:43-44. So the crowd was divided about him. Some wanted him arrested, but no one laid a hand on him. Psychocat. With 365 range, an alright attack speed, and a solid 50% chance to slow aliens from the offset, it's clear that this cat's great at his job. His only real drawback is the fact that he has pretty low HP, but that's basically it. Level 20. Like everyone else, he gains a small HP and attack boost, but nothing more. And by this point, it's highly likely that you'd be going against aliens for the first time. The thing about this cat though is that because of his really good 365 range, there aren't any common aliens aside from Moth and I'm Face who can outrange him. So for a lot of ITF levels, you're going to be bringing this guy along if you need to slow down your alien enemies. Level 30. Corrupted Psychocat gains a faster attack rate and double movement speed, so from 6 to now 12, though he gets no changes to either his range, slow chance, or slow duration. It's a solid improvement and allows him to get to the battlefield faster, and it gives him more chances to slow down his enemies. His only big weakness is the fact that he still doesn't have area attack, but that can slightly be offset by stacking him. Corrupted Psychocat maxed. Stat wise, he gains 31.5k HP or 10.5k HP per 3k beats, and he doesn't have an attack up talent. Just like most other CC units, you definitely won't be using him for stat reasons. As for what abilities he gets, he gains a 30% chance to do a 30% weaken for 4 seconds, increased slow duration from 4 seconds to 5 seconds, a 70% resistance to freeze, and now he can target zombies. The only weird one here is the 70% resistance to freeze, since the only aliens that can freeze are Moth and I'm Face, and the only zombie that can freeze is Zerzeal. Even then, 2 of those 3 enemies already outranged Corrupted Psychocat, and if Zerzeal gets within range to hit this guy, then he's dead. Versus aliens. Talents just improve what he can already do, and they give him a weaken ability. I suppose it can be useful in these situations, as you won't have to bring another weakening alien CC unit. Overall, the talents don't change much aside from improving him more from what he can already do. Versus zombies. The ability to target zombies is extremely awkward, as it can easily cut in and Psycho has no possible way to defend himself once they're within range. Because of his low max possible HP of just 31.5k, and the fact that zombies are stat based, high damage, and high HP enemies usually, he's at least going to be knocked back once in the best possible case scenario. It's an awkward matchup, but really, if he's good or not depends heavily on what stage you're bringing him onto. Is he solid? Yeah, he's alright, though maxing him isn't worth it at all. All you've got to do with this guy is talent his slow ability maybe and his weaken ability and you're good. No cat's eyes or plus levels needed, and aside from having less HP, he'll basically be the same guy as he is when maxed out, and probably get his zombie targeting talent here, that's not too bad. Onmyoji cat. Depending on the situation, this cat can either be kind of a help or just not, because of its extremely long attack animation and initial 50% chance to weaken non-metal enemies by 50% with 310 range. Level 20. Other than a small HP and damage buff, he gains nothing else. Level 30. Again, he gains an alright HP buff and some extra damage, though all he has is 179 DPS, so it doesn't matter. Now he gains a 100% chance to weaken non-metal enemies by 50%. With this, he has a 100% chance to weaken whichever enemy he can outrange for the entire time that he's alive. It's a solid role for if you need someone to weaken your enemies assuming he can outrange them, but that's about it. Damn maxed. With 29.8k or 9.9k HP per his 3k Bs and 594 DPS, his stats in this department are pitiful, but that's not what we're here for, as this is a generalist CC unit. He gains immunity to waves, a 70% resist to curse, and a 70% resist against freeze. Overall, I think that it would have made more sense for Tham to have more immunities or special defensive abilities instead of resistances against abilities, as if your Tham's being hit, then they're probably going to die very quickly due to the low HP. Versus General. A 100% chance to weaken enemies by 50% at 310 range is incredible and extremely simple. And with wave immunity, he gains the ability to get close to waivers in order to weaken them as well. This of course helps your meat shields and or tankers survive for twice as long. That's basically it, and even with talents, he does nothing more than that. His resistances against freeze and curse either only help him in super niche scenarios, like a 70% resist against freeze maybe helping against someone like Henry, or his resist against curse maybe helping if he can survive against being clipped by a relic enemy, though they don't do much for him. Is he solid? Yeah. Though him, like every CC unit so far, definitely doesn't need to be maxed out to this absurd degree, as it basically changes nothing for him. Simply getting him to level 30, getting the wave immune talent, is enough. Gardener. He's a very underused cat due to the fact that he's such a low freeze chance at 5%, despite his extremely high attack speed, which is one of the, if not the fastest in the game for your units. And also because his 200 range, single target, and low DPS isn't enough to keep zombies off of him for any amount of time, plus the fact that zombies don't even exist yet for whenever you first get this cat. Level 20. Like just about everyone else in the game, he gains a small health and damage buff, though nothing else. Using him kind of doesn't make sense outside of early game because zombies hardly exist, and because his DPS isn't good. Level 30. He gains 250 range and some more HP, and an actually strong 4-second freeze, though this doesn't help much. His chance of freezing is still 5%, so even though he has a very fast attack rate, you still can't depend on it to be effective. So most would rather use someone like Corrupted Psychocat with talents or simply Ectoweight to knock zombies back instead of freezing them. Burrowing can also easily wipe out your Gardener stacks as well, because 17k HP and 3 knockbacks, which gives him 5.6k HP per knockback, isn't much against a mostly stat-based trait. Weed Whacker maxed. With 56.4k or 18.8k HP per 3 knockbacks and 30.7k DPS, his stats become kind of alright. He gains the ability to target Aku, resist Surge by 50%, and resist Slow by 70%. Honestly, these talents are kind of a waste, though the only one I'll talk about before I get to the Aku section is the Slow one. He should have been replaced by either a talent that increases his chance of freezing or the length of freezing, or a low shield breaking chance. On top of this, slowing against Akus or zombies, both traits that are mostly stat based, isn't something you'll commonly encounter. Versus Aku. Assuming you can get a few stacked and consistently break shields, Aku enemies under 250 range are going to be stuck while receiving 3.7k DPS per weed whacker that's hitting them. Easy to say that with the units that's made to be stacked, that DPS is going to put a serious dent into your enemies. This of course assumes a lot though. Firstly, that Surges wouldn't wipe out your weed whackers even with that 50% resist against them. Surges do an absurd amount of damage, and even though Weed Whacker has 3 knockbacks, 56.4k HP, and simple resistance against them, that all probably wouldn't help too much. Secondly, it assumes that you can consistently get shield breaks off on Aku enemies, and then that's slightly more reasonable, Weed Whacker has no ability to break shields on his own. Finally, this assumes that you're fighting only Akus or zombies. Weed Whacker has 250 range and single target. It's easy for him to start hitting an enemy that he's not intending to. With all these weaknesses against Aku enemies, on top of the weakness of having a low chance to even get his freeze off despite his very high attack speed, his already questionable abilities as a freezer become basically pointless. Even with all of these buffs, he still and always is an awkward choice for our coup enemies because of their, again, extremely high damage, shields, and surges. Versus zombies. While he can outrange all common zombies, his main weakness is still present, that being his low freeze chance. His 56.4k HP and no sort of resistance against zombies or anything makes him extremely weak against them because, just like Aku's, they're mostly stat-based units with high damage. Except instead of surges, zombies can just cut him themselves and wipe out stacks of weed whackers. This happens a lot too because of their 250 range, meaning that they're basically a mid-ranger, which is usually the spot where common zombies come out from. It's possible for him to get the Z kill on zombies, sure, but it doesn't make any sense to rely on this when other zombie attackers exist, even with his 3.7k DPS and stack ability. Is he solid? No, not at all. His talents are just bad, as they address none of his already existing problems, and they give him no better matchups. The only one almost worthwhile for this cat of questionable quality is defense sub if you like him. Other than that, there's no reason to invest in him. Welterweight. Welter is kind of a weird unit. He's an anti-zombie CC unit with not much HP, and his CC ability is to knock back at a 16% chance in all of his forms. And that's about all he's known for, so he's not used very often. Level 20. Once he becomes heavyweight, he gains a little more HP and DPS, though not much else changes, and just like everyone else, this is basically the same. Level 30. This is when heavyweight becomes ectoweight. He gets a noticeable health increase, as at level 30, heavyweight has 8.1k HP versus ecto's 16k HP. He gains 1 extra DPS. His main buff though is his extra range, as now he has 280. Versus zombies, he gains a better ability to counter them, though nothing is too notable. With his 280 range, all that really changes is the fact that he can now knock back Lord Gravy, and his extra health gives him a better chance to reposition. Ecto maxed. At maximum abilities, Ecto gains 54.1k HP or 18k HP per 3k Bs and 3.3k DPS. As for his abilities, he gets a 10% chance to do a Savage Strike, 70% weaken reduction, and alien targeting. With his 540c cost and awkward cooldown, he basically becomes equivalent to an untalented level 50 plus 20 cameraman with less range. Assuming each Savage Strike hits, he'd deal a total of 18k damage, and if he could consistently do that, he'd have 9.8k DPS, though obviously this will literally never happen. Versus zombies. With these stat improvements, he'd have far better survivability and slight generalist abilities. This means that against zombies, he'd be doing a consistent 3.3k DPS with the occasional Savage Strike in the mix, so it's possible that he could actually use a Z killer ability in case you have some other units that can't Z kill. With some defense, he'd easily outrange all common types of zombies and knock them back. And even when they burrow, their generally high DPS wouldn't be as big an issue for him as it usually would be for the average level 30 ectoweight. He still has 3 knockbacks, and per those 3 he has 18k HP, so that means that against enemies like Zamel, depending on the magnification, if you have speed up cat combos, he might be able to get in close enough to knock them back, though this would probably never really work out unless you can debuff Zamel due to them always appearing magnified. Even against someone who matches his range like Angaboru, they naturally do 6k DPS and 13k damage per hit, so you'd have to debuff them before Ectoweight can really do anything notable against them. Though he is better, he gains no new favorable matchups against zombies. The same zombies that hurt him majorly continue to despite these buffs. Versus aliens. The new niche he's given by talent is a bit weird. Aliens are known for their long range, area attack, and CC abilities. A notable representative for how aliens are overall is Calamari, as he has high range, area attack, and the ability to, at a 50% chance per hit, weaken your cats by 90%. The only aliens Ectoweight can actually outrange are Starred First, Shibian, Elite, Star Pang, General Grigori, Ultra Baba, and Mesocyclone. However the hell you say that, what even is that word? Turn on subtitles, look at that word. What the hell is that? Unstarred, he can outrange Shiba Alien. Oh, Shiba Alien, okay, I get it. Croxo, Hippo, Imperator Seal, Naomi Boar, Cyberhorn, Scissors, and Miss Celiboodle. While sure, these can be annoying enemies, knocking them and only them back with something like Ectoweight's 280 range, single target, and multi-hit ability is probably not a good strategy unless your main boss is someone like Naomi Bear or Cyberhorn. If bringing him was simply for damage, then he's not really going to damage all that many aliens due to his low range in comparison to the majority of them. 54.1k HP with 18k HP per KB would be alright on a unit with area attack and slightly higher DPS, but that's just not Ectoweight. Though, with his 70% reduction on weaken, he might be able to fight Calamari and KB them if they don't do enough damage to knock them back consistently. Overall, I'd assume that he'd be fine against aliens when maxed out, since again, I don't have an 50 plus 80 fully max ectoweight for real, but alright is all he'd be overall. Versus generalists. Simple. Even with all these buffs, don't do it. Sure, you could make it work if you really wanted to, but unlike Catasaurus or something, it just doesn't make sense to bring ectoweight into all situations just in case there's a zombie or alien, because knockback is only great depending on the situation. Is he solid? No. There's no reason to get him to this absurd level, and his ability to knock back aliens and zombies is just fine naturally. Since none of these talents help him do that, I'd suggest just going for his defensive talent at most, as all of his other talents are basically failed attempts at making this guy some kind of generalist. Rover, initially sort of awkward meat shield, as aliens aren't very important when you first get him, but later on he becomes one of the most integral anti-aliens that you bring into every single loadout when fighting them. Level 20, all he gains is a nice HP and damage boost, so it's probable that you'd use him a bit more as a generalist. Against aliens, thanks to his strong against ability, he'd have better defense and more damage, so he'd do good against them. Level 30, the only buff he gains stat wise is extra damage, though the most striking one is his cost reduction, as it goes from 300 to 270C. At basically all points, due to this very small difference, it may be advantageous to use a second form over his final form due to cost restrictions on some levels, and the damage difference as a second form would be better for just keeping an enemy in place as it has less damage. CATLANTIS Max. CATLANTIS gains 45k HP and 6k DPS. As for his abilities, he gains a 10% chance to break barriers, curse immunity, and a 50% resistance against knockback. Overall, strange abilities, as you'd probably expect something like weaken or maybe speed up or something like that, but none of that is here. Versus aliens. Against aliens, thanks to a strong against ability, he has 90.2k HP and 9k DPS. His HP and DPS is pretty absurd, especially for a 270C easily spammable unit. Just alone, he could serve as a great attacker and of course great defender, and most likely, even though his recharge time is the same as usual light tankers, he could probably be your only meat shield on top of maybe tankers like Soap if you want to be safe. The only awkward thing is that with such an absurd, easily stackable DPS value, he wouldn't be able to stall enemies at all unless they're insanely boosted or something. With 27.4k damage per hit, this guy's gonna be chipping like crazy anyway, and most likely break the barriers of more annoying enemies. And for enemies that have insane barriers like Ultra Baba, he could be used to stall them out thanks to his insane HP. That would be if, again, he didn't have a 10% barrier breaking chance. CATLANTIS just isn't supposed to be a pusher. He's a meat shield made to stall, so him being able to break barriers can kind of mess up either cheat strategies or simple stalling for getting money if that's what you're trying to do. It's not really a great ability, and his resistance to knockback doesn't help him all that much unless you're fighting Naomi Boar. The 50% reduction doesn't seem like much when you're fighting such a hard pusher, so really both of those talents are at best a waste of NP, and the barrier breaker is at worst a destroyer for some effective strategies. Versus relics. With 45k HP and 6k DPS, and also the existence of Mer-cat, it makes no sense to use him against a trait that both deals monstrous levels of damage, has very high range, and powerful debuffs. Besides, stages that exist with just aliens and relics are rare, and only in those situations, assuming that there's a relic on the stage that just curses your units, will he actually be useful. At least I haven't gotten to the part of the game where there are bases that shoot curse beams and stuff at your units, so maybe he's useful on stages like that. Maybe that starts happening a lot where in tandem with alien, I don't know, but it doesn't seem like that great of an ability overall. Versus general. He'd function as a high DPS meat shield with easy stackability, and he'd be useful for at least chipping down enemies you've got to fight. I mean, for 270C, you get to throw out a cat that'll definitely deal 18.3k damage to whoever, maybe a little bit more and then die. That's some strong chipping power, and if we compare it to Dancer's damage at level 30 base, he'd only be dealing 2k damage less than that. Is he solid? Absolutely, just don't get his talents aside from attack and defense up. The only one I can kind of see being useful maybe is a 50% resistance against knockback, but even then you could use your NP elsewhere more effectively. Matador. Dodge is a niche strange ability, and for the most of the game, his 30% chance to do a 2-second dodge won't be preferable over normal red light tankers and normal tankers, especially given its 540C cost. Level 20. He gains a small HP and damage increase, but yeah, you know, not much changes. Level 30. For the frankly absurd cost of a freaking epic cat fruit seed, all he gains is 5k more HP and 4 more movement speed. Before talents existed, there wouldn't be any reason to use this guy, and even when fighting reds, there's still little reason to use this 20.4k HP dodge unit over the infinitely more dependable, slightly higher costing, once talented Mer-cat. You're relying on a 30% chance for 3 seconds of immortality every single time you spend 540C whenever you send this guy out. Belly Dancer is just not good. Comparing that to actually reliable, definite HP, you make your choice. Belly Dancer Cat maxed. By now, he'd have 67.6k HP or 22.5k HP per his 3 knockbacks, and 3.7k DPS. As for his new abilities, he gained Aku targeting, 30% chance to inflict a 2-second slow, and a 70% reduction to freeze. Overall, interesting talents that give him a new niche with a rare strange ability. Versus Aku's. Though he doesn't have surge immunity, he still has a pretty beefy amount of HP, and his knockbacks allow for him to basically retry 3 times if his dodge doesn't go off, so that he's not one shot. He's still a dodge chance meat shield at the end of the day though, and with other options like Cactus or the superior brainwash Mohawk within the same niche, using this 540C meat shield that might maybe dodge Aku's is way worse or alright than dependable solutions, because remember, the defensiveness of this unit is fully based on luck. On top of this, his slowing ability for 2 seconds is pretty worthless most of the time. It's only at a 30% chance, and it being effective fully relies on if you have a few of these guys out. And given the fact that he's pretty costly for his role, it's easy to see why something like Shield Breaker or a talent that increases dodge chance would have been far better. Versus Reds. Similarly to Aku's, his defensiveness against Reds depends on if his dodge goes off. Against enemies like Professor A, Cappy, or faster enemies, his slowing and dodge chance could help a bit with stalling, though overall, I still think it'd make more sense to use dependable tankers like Ro in most scenarios, assuming the damage Reds are doing isn't an unthinkable amount. Versus Generalist. Obviously, don't use them against anything but Aku's or Reds, and don't use them in mixed stages either. This unit has a nice amount of HP, but not enough to be a light meat shield alongside fighting Reds and or Aku's. If you want someone like that, then maybe go for Maximum the Fighter. Is he solid? No, not really. Unless you have no other options, it probably isn't even worth getting the true form. And if anything, at most, you should probably just get their Aku dodge challenge for Aku realms or Aku only stages. Wushu. Finally, we have Wushu. More than anything, he's a slightly worse version of CATLANTIS with a higher cost and initially a little less health, though he has resistance against zombies. So early on, he's going to be the guy that you use versus zombies in all situations. Level 20. As you could probably guess, Sifu gets a little bit more HP and damage, but aside from that, nothing really changes. Level 30. By level 30, Shingon gains some more HP and immunity to slow. By now, he has a little more HP and DPS than CATLANTIS, though he costs more and has a longer cooldown than regular light tankers. His immunity to slow basically doesn't matter as much as you think, as the only normal zombie that slows is Zomboy, and the only big zombie that does is the Boo. Shingon maxed. At maximum abilities, he gains 54.1k HP and 8.5k DPS. As for his abilities, he gains a 5% chance to do a 50% weaken for 3 seconds, warp immunity, and a 70% resistance against freeze. Overall, really good talents. Versus zombies. When fighting zombies, he'd have 216k HP, and with the 50% weaken, he'd have 433k HP. It's extremely absurd, though this is balanced out by the fact that he only has a 5% chance to even get his weaken off. Because of this, you'd have to get a lot of Shingongs on the field before their weaken ability could even come off commonly. So it'd probably be better to just bring a unit that can weaken all enemies instead of relying on his weaken. Given his 8.5k DPS as well and his absurd survivability versus this trait, there's no way that a few of these guys wouldn't be enough to wipe out just about every stage. His warp immunity is basically only useful on stages where star aliens that can warp accompany zombies. And though this will help a bit, these situations are very niche, and versus said warping aliens, he'd only have 54.1k HP. Zappy is also the only zombie that can warp, but this barely comes into play because his chance is very low at 15%, and he at 100% magnification has 34.5k DPS. Versus Generalist. 54.1k HP and 8.5k DPS is really good, though he has a pretty slow recharge time and an alright cost. As a light tanker, he'd most likely be alright, and assuming he can, for example, get into blind spots or tank decently against slow attacking enemies, that's easily stackable 8.5k DPS is going to stack up fast. Is he solid? Yeah, he becomes a total monster, though his talents probably could have been a little better. With them though, and a totally max level, you're going to absolutely wipe out most zombie only stages with just him alone. Before we finish the video, here's a final verse from the Bible. This time it won't be from John because I've chosen John a few times. Hebrews 13:8. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I hope you all enjoyed this extremely long video. Getting the footage and recording this one was pretty time consuming, but hey, you all really wanted it like 2 months ago now. So you got it, even if I was pretty darn late. Subscribe right now because you watched this whole thing, so you'll like all of my other stuff. Like the video, become a member, and join the server, and most importantly, if you haven't already, become a Christian because it's awesome and it's true. Have a good day, everyone.